Honourable Members, I have received letters from Grant Robertson and Dr Russell Norman seeking to debate under Standing Order 386 the release of the Cabinet Secretary's report on the Government Communication Security Bureau. This is a particular case of recent occurrence for which there is ministerial responsibility. Given the public interest in this matter and the need for a high level of public confidence in our security agencies, I consider it important enough to warrant the immediate attention of the House by way of an urgent debate. As Grant Robertson lodged his application first, I call on Grant Robertson to move that the House take note of a matter of urgent public importance.
Mr Speaker, I so move. New Zealanders can no longer trust John Key. They can no longer trust his word, and they can no longer trust that he is acting in the interests of New Zealanders. That is the lesson, Mr Speaker, of Rebecca Kitteridge's report. John Key knew in July 2012 that New Zealanders may well have been illegally spied upon, and he covered up that fact. He stood in front of a press conference in September 2012 and he was asked if the Kim.com spying was an isolated incident. And what he said was, the advice I have had in 4 years as a minister is that in no way ever has there been an indication of unlawful spying. Yet he was told, Mr Speaker, in July 2012 that there was a concern about unlawful spying. He covered it up. But, Mr Speaker, what's even worse is he did nothing about that information. He was given that information in July 2012 and he sat on it. And today in the House, Bill English has stood up and said, oh no, that's not what happened. Well, I want to quote to Mr English from John Key's press statement yesterday. I was first told of a potential issue in July by GCSB Director Ian Fletcher. Lawyers from the GCSB and SIS were in correspondence with the Inspector-General and Crown Law, and I asked Mr Fletcher to keep me informed. Here's the money shot. The issue was unresolved. The issue was unresolved. So Mr Key knew that there was considerable doubt about whether or not New Zealanders were being spied on illegally, and he did nothing. He sat on his hands and allowed New Zealanders to be spied on unlawfully. The first Prime Minister to have that drawn to his attention, and he did nothing. And the question for Mr Key and Mr English is, how much of that spying went on after July? How much of that spying went on when the Prime Minister had been informed? New Zealanders have been let down time and again by this government and by this Prime Minister. On every aspect of this issue, of the GCSB and of Kim.com, John Key has had to be dragged up to give us information, to give New Zealanders information about how their spy agency is operating. Time and again, Mr Speaker, he has left out details, forgotten information, was unable to recall briefings. That is not acceptable, Mr Speaker. We rely on Mr Key as the Minister responsible for the GCSB to be on top of his job, to know what's happening in his job, and he has failed. He has covered up and he has failed to manage the GCSB in the interests of New Zealanders. He has let New Zealanders down, Mr Speaker, when it comes to his management. His oversight of this agency is lax at best and deliberately misleading at worst. Mr Speaker, the GCSB operates in a space where the fundamental freedoms of New Zealanders are in question, whether or not people will be spied upon. And Mr Key has been lax enough in his oversight that when he was told in July 2012 that that spying may well be unlawful, he did nothing. He sat on his hands and he allowed New Zealanders to be spied on unlawfully. He is not up to being the Minister responsible for the GCSB. He has let New Zealanders down, and New Zealanders do not know that they can trust their Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, and there is not much worse than that. But we need to go back a step in this, Mr Speaker, because this fits in to the whole GCSB Kim.com debacle. And it's important to go through step by step, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's role and the extent to which he's been prepared to cover up what's happened here. In 2011, Mr Speaker, the United States authorities were working with the New Zealand government on the idea of being able to arrest Kim.com. In December and January 2011 and January 2012, Ofcans and the GCSB were monitoring Kim.com. We know that. It's come out. They discussed his residency status. In February 2012, Ian Fletcher comes in as the Director of GCSB, and Mr Speaker, I'm going to return to that appointment shortly. On the 16th of February, Ian Fletcher attends a debriefing meeting about the Kim.com raids. 16th of February. At that meeting, Mr Speaker, Mr .com's residency status is raised. And we know from court affidavits that immediately after that point, GCSB believed that the spying was unlawful. On February the 22nd, GCSB staff wrote that they believed that the spying was unlawful. And we have been asked to believe time and again, Mr Speaker, that Ian Fletcher didn't think this was important enough to talk to John Key about in the numerous meetings that he held with him. Magically, Mr Speaker, 5 days after this, someone fathomed up some legal advice to say, actually, it was lawful after all. There were 5 different versions of that legal advice, Mr Speaker, in those 5 days. We have not had access to that because that material is deemed legally privileged by Chris Finlayson. But somehow at the end of that, the GCSB thought they could justify this. Then in May, Mr Speaker, May 2012, Paul Naser raises the question with the GCSB, is their spying unlawful? He raises that question with Ian Fletcher. That's what the Rebecca Kitteridge report tells us. Somehow or other, he waits a little while, and then he tells John Key in July 2012 that there are concerns that the spying is unlawful. John Key has been a part of this process all the way through, Mr Speaker. But then, mysteriously, in August 2012, when it comes time, apparently, for Mr Fletcher to pop across the road to Parliament and say, we need a ministerial certificate signed to suppress the involvement of the GCSB in this case, John Key's not there. He's overseas. So the person who signs that ministerial certificate to suppress information about the role of the GCSB is Bill English. Bill English signs that certificate off. Now, I know the relationship between Mr English and Mr Key isn't everything it could be, given their history. But we are asked to believe that when Mr Key returns from being overseas, he does not even talk to Bill English about this. A ministerial certificate, Mr Speaker, that has never been used, the power that has never been used, and Bill English doesn't bother to tell John Key about it. It defies belief, Mr Speaker, and there are certainly questions to be answered around that ministerial certificate. And then finally, Mr Speaker, in September last year, John Key fronts up for the first time about Kim.com. September, 7 months after the GCSB identified unlawful spying. And we hear Bill English today stand up and say, as soon as the government became aware of unlawful spying, they stepped in. That is not true, Mr Speaker. They knew in February, it was raised again in May. John Key found out about it in July. Bill English signed a certificate to suppress the evidence in August. And John Key tries to tell New Zealanders that September was the first time he had heard about it. That is misleading, Mr Speaker. That is why New Zealanders cannot trust John Key any longer. This debacle with Kim.com and GCSB is at the feet of the Prime Minister. He has let New Zealanders down with his lax oversight of GCSB, and he has let New Zealanders down by not being upfront with them, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I do want to briefly refer to the questions that weren't put in this report by Rebecca Kitteridge. There is no mention in this report of what happened in the Kim.com case. That is a remarkable thing, Mr Speaker, given that the Kim.com case is the reason the report got written. Now, Rebecca Kitteridge states in here, and she clearly was concerned enough to write this, that she wasn't asked to do that. She wasn't asked to look at that. Well, there's a reason for that, Mr Speaker, because the Prime Minister doesn't want it looked at. The Prime Minister doesn't want his role to be exposed. Because there's also nothing in this report, Mr Speaker, about ministerial oversight, about how ministerial oversight should work in an agency like the GCSB. And the GCSB, Mr Speaker, has powers that many New Zealanders are uncomfortable about. powers to spy on people. And there is nothing more important for Mr Key in his job, in my view, than protecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of New Zealanders to know that they can go about their business and not be spied upon unnecessarily. And in this case, Mr Speaker, this report does not go there. Now, Mr Speaker, it's also very important to look at what else this report says. John Key is the first Prime Minister acting under the 2003 Act to have been told that there may be problems with unlawful spying. The first Prime Minister to do that. That's what this says, and there is nowhere in here that we actually get John Key fronting up and saying ministerial responsibility is important. I'm acting on behalf of New Zealanders. I'm going to make sure I act in the best interest of New Zealanders and adopt a precautionary approach that says, if I get information that there may be unlawful spying, I will inquire into it. Mr Speaker, we desperately need, as David Shearer has suggested, a full and comprehensive inquiry into all the intelligence agencies. It's not good enough for the government to propose piecemeal reform where they'll try and make legal what's been illegal in the past. There are too many questions to be answered about that, Mr Speaker. And Bill English put up a straw man today about the fact that the SIS can spy on people. The point is, Mr English, that the GCSB is not allowed to spy on New Zealanders. GCSB is not allowed to spy on New Zealanders because they work with foreign governments. And the SIS can spy on New Zealanders because that information will stay in New Zealand. And Mr English knows full well that that is why there is a difference between the GCSB and the SIS. Mr Speaker, I want to finally turn to the appointment of Ian Fletcher. John Key was asked direct questions in this House about his relationship with Ian Fletcher and the role he played in Mr Fletcher's appointment. He avoided those questions. He did not tell the truth to this House about his knowledge of that appointment process. We've been told by Ian Rennie that John Key is the person that scrapped the shortlist of candidates, and that it's John Key who made the phone call to Ian Fletcher that fundamentally changed that appointment process. Ian Fletcher was the only person interviewed for that job 5 days after John Key made that phone call. That is not a proper and fair and transparent process, Mr Speaker. And all John Key can do in response to that is blame the messenger. Call them knuckleheads. Well, Mr Speaker, those journalists have done New Zealanders a favour because they have exposed that this is a Prime Minister who cannot be trusted, who's more interested in jobs for his mates and not interested enough in the rights and freedoms of New Zealanders. New Zealanders cannot trust John Key.
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Bill English.
Well, my colleague asks a very good question. How was